recalibrating your compass so that you can find vitality there too. So it's not just a downer. Like the composting can actually be quite joyful, but it's not, what we say in the project is that it's joyful but not pleasurable, because pleasure is still an object of consumption, right? And joy interpolates and surprises you when it comes up. So figuring out the right amount of humor, the right amount of movement, the right amount of intellect and embodied or affective work. But it's the same with the composting. If you use composting as a metaphor, it's the right amount of carbon, it's the right amount of it's the right amount of oxygen. You have to have the right things to do the composting, and it's the same with the body.
Greetings, friends. You're listening to the As Temperatures Rise podcast, where we dialogue about what it means to be human in these complex and troubled times. I'm your host, Katie Teague, and that was the voice of Professor Vanessa Andreotti. Vanessa is an educational studies professor and researcher on race, inequalities, and global change at the University of British Columbia. Her work focuses on the limits of the modern colonial story of development and human evolution, with a specific focus on the adjacent possibilities of setting our horizons beyond what we can imagine within modern institutions and ways of knowing and being. This is the second part of our interview that actually took place before part one, so there is some repetition, but Vanessa's articulations are so unique in my experience that it bears repeating. And I urge you to make it through the entire conversation, because at the very end, Vanessa shares an exquisite story from the Cree elder, John Cryer. It's a story of 4 mountains that illuminates the human developmental journey and where we get stuck along the way. I won't spoil it for you, so I'll just leave it at that. Vanessa's message in total and her work is a deep invitation for us as humanity to grow up, clean up, and show up. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Vanessa.
Okay, so I am speaking from the Musqueam Reserve. So UBC, which is where I work, the University of British Columbia, is located on unceded ancestral lands of the Musqueam Indigenous people, and their reservation is right opposite to UBC, right adjacent to UBC, and I live here. So it's very important, I think, to acknowledge whose lands we're on. And I'm also coming from a family that has mixed heritage. It's Brazilian, German and Indigenous ancestry. And in their tradition, in the tradition of the Guarani people, I've been asked to do another kind of land acknowledgement, where you acknowledge first the land as a living entity, not resource, not property. The second acknowledgement is the acknowledgement that our ancestors, both the people who have come before and those yet to come, have negotiated for us to be here today, and ask us to recognize that a lot of violence goes on so that we're able to speak, from the minerals that go into the screens of our computers to everything that creates the livelihoods that we have. So there's a responsibility that comes with acknowledging that violence. And the third acknowledgement is the acknowledgement of those who have made it possible for us to be here. So I'd like to thank you, Katie, for inviting me. And the last acknowledgement is that we're all parentes. Parentes mean, it can't be translated very easily into English, but we're all kin, we're all family of human and non-human entities, part of a wider metabolism, and that this metabolism is sick. And if the metabolism is sick, so are we, and we have a responsibility to heal. So that's the second acknowledgement.
Well, thank you. You already answered lots of my questions around why these acknowledgements are important. And I will just join you in my acknowledgement in that I'm living with gratitude on the forcibly ceded territories of the Takelma and Cow Creek Umpqua nations. So, gesturing towards decolonial futures is an international collective that you are co-parenting, co-learning, co-coing.
Co-nurturing.
Co-nurturing.
Yes.
Thank you. And I feel like we could spend a lot of time on each of those words in the title, feel very, very deliberate. But let's start off with a little bit more about your background that brought you to this confluence with this collective, and who is the collective and what the mission of the collective is.
Okay, so that's a big one. So I come from a mixed heritage family, as I mentioned before, where my dad in the 60s was trying to make a stand against his brothers who were involved in agrarian expansion in Brazil. And agrarian expansion in Brazil means genocide for the indigenous people there. And he thought that that was not right. And he decided to make a stand by marrying an indigenous person. But he also wanted to marry her because he believed the German culture has a level of superiority, and he wanted to whiten and enfranchise the indigenous people so that they wouldn't be vulnerable anymore. So I guess I was born out of a paradox of an attempt to change the world that was at the same time progressive and racist. And I think having been born from that paradox, I grew up looking at the complexities of the relationship between those who see themselves as heading humanity and those who are perceived to be dragging behind or being carried up in this ladder of social mobility. And I think this attention to paradoxes accompanied me throughout my education, throughout my life. And the work of the collective is very much focused on complexities and paradoxes of questions of racism, colonialism, questions of unsustainability. So basically we say that we work at the interface of questions of historical, systemic, and ongoing violence and questions of unsustainability, the fact that our ways of being are not sustainable in a finite planet. And generally what you see is that these two communities, the communities focusing on sustainability and unsustainability, and communities focusing on violence, they generally do not intersect. Or when they intersect, there is uneasiness because many of the solutions proposed on each side become contradictory once you bring these communities together. And articulating paradoxes and articulating the difficulties of this relationship, I think, is something that we're not trained to do. We're trained to look for solutions, and we're trained to move forward. We're trained to actually turn our back to what's difficult. So the collective came together with a sense that for us to be able to deal with what we have to do right now and what is to come, we need to expand our capacity to hold space for what's difficult, what's painful, what's complex, what's paradoxical, and without being immobilized, irritated, or wanting to be rescued or coddled in the process. So this idea of being rescued from discomfort is something that modernity, I think, instills on us. That there's a promise of comfort. There's a promise of safety and a promise of security, a promise of pleasure. And this is all done through consumption. And we wanted to figure out a way to have conversations about that without relationships falling apart. And so we it was a collective that came from different networks, but generally people interested basically in exploring the paradox and articulating the paradoxes, in mapping the tensions between different communities to try to figure out a way where we can hold space for the difficult things in preparation for facing a major storm together.
That's a tall order and such a different approach than most initiatives, like you were saying before. Usually it's head on looking for the solution, mm-hmm. versus this starting place of admitting the paradoxes and the tensions, and it's going to be painful, it's going to trigger us, right? So how to build this capacity within ourselves and in our relationships.
Yeah, and it's not just an intellectual problem, right? So actually the way that we have related to the intellect is part of the problem, why we can't, where we feel that we can't go in that direction. But we talk about intellectual, affective, relational, economic, ecological, and political forms of unlearning and healing, figuring out a different way of existing together. The other thing I think that is interesting about the collective is that we work a lot with the unconscious too. So once you take that, what we would say, it's a non-Western psychoanalytic term, because like in Western psychoanalysis, we would have meaning as or the human body as the anchoring measure of things. But the kind of psychoanalysis we're working with, and probably we're using psychoanalysis because it's the easiest word that can bridge that gap. The kind of psychoanalysis we're learning with and from center the land and sees the land as a conscious entity that is biointelligent. So it's not a human-centered approach or pedagogy. It's a pedagogy that asks us to declutter our existence so that the land can dream and speak and act through us, so that we sense ourselves. It's not a conceptual problem. We can think ourselves as part of a wider metabolism. That's one thing. But the other thing is to actually remove the barriers that make us feel separate. And these are neurobiological barriers. These are addictions and insecurities and investments and desires that we would call colonial, that are extremely difficult to be undone. They work like addiction. So, and they probably require a rock bottom for us to be able to really get ourselves out of that. And even then, it is extremely complicated. So saying you are outside or saying that you feel connected is not the same as actually neurobiologically mobilizing this connection and reactivating the capacities that this connection entails, right? So learning from indigenous communities, not only in Latin America, we do have a network in Latin America that works very closely with the collective. There is another, it's part of the collective, but there's another network in Canada that is also very much grounding the collective. But there are other networks around where we really pay attention to how indigenous communities have kept practices that mobilize a different physiology, a different affective landscape, a different in very different possibilities for relationship and relationship building and relationality that are outside of what we can even imagine when we are invested in this harmful way of being that is based on consumption, not only of stuff, but also of knowledge, of experiences, of relationships, of people, and even of critique. So realizing that as an academic, for example, that critique or more description or more prescription wouldn't really change much. It can address some symptoms of the problems, but it wouldn't change the root causes of our predicament. Then I think got a number of us into saying, we actually don't know. And this position of not knowing is, I think, what creates a little bit more humility and this de-arrogantization that this is about us. This is not about us. This is about about something much bigger than us, and not just about humans. It's about something that is not in our temporality. So locating what matters, what is important, somewhere that is not our temporality or our body, but seeing ourselves in that too, was one of the first lessons that we had when we started this journey. And this lesson comes from communities that have kept these practices. But we do not encourage the idea that they have the solutions either, because that's another form of consumption. So going there to find a replacement for what we have is not what we think we think we're not doing that, but maybe sometimes we may fall back into that. But we think that what these communities can do for us is just remind us that there are possibilities that are unfathomable and that are healthier and more sober, more mature, that require more humility, and that can engender a different kind of world, a different kind of relationship with the planet, a different kind of existence.
So many places I find myself wanting to latch onto and dive deeper. And I love this term, de-arrogantizing. Let's go with that one. So yeah, I really got lit up when I was reading about this notion of the unconscious as you were saying, like an indigenous psychoanalysis, where I was trained in psychology, where it's highly human centric, right? Where you're flipping the script to where we are an extension of the land. The land is dreaming us in this matrix of entanglement, and it really shifts the ontology. Mm-hmm. But I want to back up before we go further down that road back to the name gesturing towards decolonial futures. There are many different approaches and ideas around what colonialism is, and I think you have a unique perspective on the term you use, modernity, coloniality, and that the root cause is not just a subjugation of people or a taking of lands. So yeah, let's just start off at the top with your understanding of what coloniality is.
So the modernity / coloniality or hyphen coloniality comes from a body of scholarship from Latin America, which is the modernity coloniality group. I think they have a different name. I just can't recall it right now, but it's generally in that area. But their understanding is still very much focused on subjugation of people and occupation of lands. Our understanding, coming from, again, the practices of the indigenous communities we're working with, but also indigenous literature, is that the problem with colonialism is an ontometaphysical one. It's related to how we relate to the land and beyond the land. So we call it separability. And we have a metaphor to talk about that, which is we call it a social cartography of the house modernity built. So in this cartography, we have the foundation of the house. So you can need to imagine a house sitting on the planet, and the house is becoming bigger than the planet, exceeding the limits of the planet. But there's the planet, and the foundation of the house is a separation between humans and the land and the metabolism of the planet. And we use the word metabolism to talk about the dynamic nature of things. So talking about the land as land, we imagine something static or static. And what we want to focus on is on the movement of things and the catalysis and the change process that happens in this entanglement. So the foundation of the house is a foundation of separability. One of the carrying walls is the carrying wall of universal reason or Western humanism. The other carrying wall is the carrying wall of the nation state, the modern nation state. And then there are different roofs, but the current roof is a triangular roof of financial speculative capitalism that's coming from the old roof of industrial capitalism, but there's also the roof of socialism. So you have different roofs in this house, but in the structure is the same, but there are also decorative walls that change. And the house is also an entity and has a history. So it had an early period, it had a peak period, and there's a late period, but these periods are not, they cannot be applied to the whole house at the same time. They happen as events in different temporalities also within the house. So we use the house modernity build to talk about the costs of the house. So the way that there's expropriation, destitution, dispossession, genocide for its construction and for its maintenance, the ways that the waste of the house, the sewage of the house goes back into the planet. So there's a lot of extraction and waste disposal there that is creating the conditions of unsustainability. But we also talk about the house to talk about like this idea of social mobility, the stairs inside the house. There's a basement in the house, there's stairs, there's an attic or a penthouse, and the stairs of social mobility, which become the purpose of the existence of the house in our contemporary society. So all the desires and the feedback loops, affective feedback loops that the house creates in terms of harnessing or creating certain fears. These fears become desires that compensate for those fears, and from these desires they become entitlements. So if you're thinking about, for example, the fear of scarcity becomes a desire for accumulation that then becomes an entitlement to property, and this feedback loop is extremely difficult to be broken. But now that the house is facing multiple crises, we will need to sit with this, with what we've learned from the house or what we don't want to learn in a very different way if we want to survive its demise. The house also promises a sense of enthronement, the sense of authority, control, arbitration, autonomy, unrestricted and unaccountable autonomy, that if not identified, if these desires are not identified, and if they are not identified as socially conditioned, all our attempts to transgress the house or to challenge the house will continue reproducing the same feedback loops, right? So one of the things that we do in the collective is to look at attempts to change the house and to struggles for liberation, for example, or identity struggles, and the ways in which these struggles also reflect the ontology that the house authorizes. And for them to be intelligible within the house, they have to do that. Like for you to have access to what the house offers, you do have to reproduce its grammar, its language. But at the same time, what happens when this is not working anymore and we get to a point where, okay, I may be fighting for the throne, but the roof is collapsing. And what is actually needed is evacuation from the house rather than fighting for or being offered a plastic throne or
patching up the house.
So this is the kind of thing that we try to do, and we have to be very conscious of the ways that we also reproduce the same grammar in order to become intelligible within the house, right? So it's not something that we're looking from the outside. A lot of our experiments are on ourselves and seeing if there's any opening to something that may be viable, but that is unimaginable within the house.
And in my book, that makes the collective more trustworthy. You're eating your own dog food, so to speak.
Yeah.
And you're speaking to many questions that I have, which it seems like in this time of COVID, and I live in Southern Oregon, where the fires just ripped through and literally decimated 2,400 houses that modernity built. Sadly, many of them were already the underprivileged. And it feels like the house is falling apart, and it's becoming more apparent. And what I'm understanding from the collective and what I've read and researched is like the meta crises that we are now clearly in are a result of habits of being, like a basic ontology. So it gets back to like, how does one shift an ontology when it is the water that we're swimming in? And that comes back to the unconscious. We have to look at our desires and these drives that are enacting our behaviors that we're largely not conscious of.
Yeah, in the collective, we do have a proverb from Brazil that really orients what we're doing, I think, which is the idea that in a flood situation, it's also water, but in a flood situation, it's only when the water reaches your hip or your bum that you can actually swim. So for you to change from walking to swimming, which would be this ontological shift, right? You would need to have water up to your hip. If the water is at your ankles or the water is at your knees, you can only walk or wade in this. So you will have to continue to walk. And if people see the water at their ankle, they might have an interest in what we're talking about, but the system is still working for them. But with the fires that are raging right now also in the Amazon, so that the forest can be cleared, so that there's more cattle or soya for other people to consume, right? So with this, it's the water rising, and then there's more people who are interested in the possibility of swimming. Lots of people thinking that they can't swim at all. And I think what the indigenous communities that we're working with are saying is that they don't have the answers either, but they can remind us that our bodies can also swim. We're mostly water. So this idea of breathing water, being water, becoming water, being in the water, is something that really inspires us too. There are lots of metaphors of water that we use. One of them is the Titanic too. How do we, in a situation where, for example, in relation to the debate 2 days ago, one candidate is saying there's no iceberg. We're just gonna make this ship go very quick, and by securing my autonomy or my throne, you're securing all of your thrones, and we'll just get rid of the dead weight of the bodies that are against this project, right? We're just going to throw them overboard. This happened in Brazil, by the way, too, with Bolsonaro. It was the same tactic. And the other candidate saying, no, there's no iceberg, which it's just that the boat is tilting, and if we just pull together, we will be able to just run the course. But there is an iceberg, which is both existential and material, with climate change, with an economy that is destructive, with a way of relating to the world that is unsatisfactory and insatiable in its consumption. Of course, people know that it's not working, but the ways that we understand the problem will determine, and then the ways we feel in the unconscious too, the ways that the unconscious is saturated with a lot of, in the project again, and I'll ask for forgiveness for using these words. We say that there's a lot of unsaturated shit.
I think it needs to be said. You can say it on my podcast.
Collective shit, individual shit that is not being processed. Partly also because separability, like this foundation of the house, creates a barrier for the shit to be composted, right? It goes in the toilet, it goes in the water, and it goes away. But there's no away. It's one planet, it's one metabolism. So part of the problem is that there's a lot of, if we don't even want to look at shit, both individual and collective shit, there's no starter, right? And we are not very good at composting shit because we've been separated from that land for a long time. So learning to declutter in that way, in turning shit into new soil, means we will have to deal with things that are painful. We will need to shift our relationship with pain in order to be able to do that. And this is not easy because we come from a medical system too, where well-being means the absence of pain. You can't be well unless you're pain-free. And it is separability too, I think. One of the metaphors we use in the project and the collective is, again, it's a speculative. I'm not a neuroscientist. It's metaphorical. Is that this separability creates a neurobiological problem. So it could be a deficiency in the production of serotonin, right? Serotonin is the neurotransmitter that makes us feel connected with everything. And it is consumed now in different ways. As people go do ceremonies in Peru with ayahuasca, they go for serotonin, and it's more complex than serotonin too, but they go for personal power or personal healing. When these ceremonies have been used ancestrally for responsibility and accountability, but because we can't connect with that sense of responsibility, accountability, or coming of age, we go there for something else, for just keeping our consumption and self-actualization, to keeping this process. But anyway, the idea is that separability, let's say it creates a serotogenic deficiency. And in that serotogenic deficiency, it also takes away the intrinsic value of your life. So it creates that lack that where for you to have value, you have to keep producing value in the economies of modernity, both the material economies, the intellectual economies, the affective economies. So you're constantly trying to produce value so that you can have a sense of worth back. And this is insatiable. That's what is at the bottom of consumption. We are trying to fill an emptiness, because if we are not plus one, we go to minus one. But what we need to do is get to zero. Unless we have a sense of intrinsic value, unless we have a connection with the medicines we carry, and unless we reactivate some of these exiled capacities that modernity has exiled, has restricted, or prevented us from accessing, it's going to be very difficult to compost that shit. So both the turning people from wanting to feel good or look good to looking in the mirror and seeing what's not beautiful and not turning the gaze, and seeing humanity too, in the good, the bad, the ugly, the broken, the messed up. Unless we can stomach that, we will continue to use resources and energy in it, putting it into trying to fix something that is already, and has always been beyond repair, right? It has its own cycle, its own life cycle, and as we come to its end, those who are super invested in keeping it alive, in keeping it in the form of, we talk about the difference between palliative care and keeping something in life support, right? So that this is the difference. That's why we talk about hospicing modernity. Hospicing the house is about repurposing a few things, but figuring out other forms of shelter that may take the form of a house or not, right?
Yeah, as you were speaking, I was sensing that underneath so much of what you're speaking is this base fear of death in our
Mm-hmm.
in our death illiterate culture. A medical
Yeah.
system that even tries to defy aging and death at all costs.
Yeah, we have in the collective, we have a subgroup looking at death, dying, and aging and eldership from that perspective too. So I think the fundamental fear, maybe the house was built to try to defeat death, right? And to protect us from pain. And to, it's death, pain, scarcity. There's also this fundamental fear of worthlessness. So we depend on the house for a sense of worth, but that fear of worthlessness is part of the separability thing. Yeah, and I think unless we can live and die well, and we've shifted the root metaphor from the good life to living and dying well, we're going to be trying to protect the entitlements that this good life has promised, that the house has promised.
And ironically, potentially hastening our own extinction.
Yes, and killing each other in the process, right?
And creating a lot of suffering and killing in the process. Yeah, so I understand now. I just interviewed our friend Bayo Akamalafe, and I really am getting the parallel. You have different language, but it's equally about, to use his terminology, turning and looking at the monstrosity.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, or looking at the shit, and we can't just keep flushing the shit down the toilet. And this realization that there's transformation in the shit. There's, when we learn how to compost it, there's deep nutrients for regeneration. And I
think there's another philosopher that we work with, Sharon Todd, who talks about part of this problem is the romanticization of humanity. So we tend to look at humanity as this incredible flower, amazing
the apex of creation.
Apex of creation, exactly. And then let's not talk even about the modern man as the apex of evolution, but let's just stay with the humanity part of it. And she talks about the creation of the inhuman. When we say something is inhuman, as that separation that of humanity, where humanity becomes idealized. And then you have people like Martha Nussbaum, who says, well, we need to cultivate humanity within us. What she says is that we need to face humanity. We need to face all the human wrongs and all the shit that has gone on, and process the shit and process the pain that goes with the shit. Otherwise, it saturates in the unconscious, right? And in the body and in the genealogies, and it can become epigenetic, right? The inability to process the shit and the pain and the insecurities and the projections. And the whole expectations, idealizations that go in there, they are all part of the thing that needs to be composted, right? So starting with her, I think this distinction between the human and the inhuman, you see it everywhere. And people really want to associate with what's human. So when we talk, for example, about Indigenous people having a much more entangled approach or way of seeing themselves in relationship to nature, those with that understanding, romanticized understanding of humanity, see themselves wanting to be connected, but they want to be connected with the flowers, the moon, the sun, the whales, never with the shade. So it's
with the rainbows and unicorns.
Exactly. So and it's interesting because if you go to the practices of Indigenous people, they're usually involving a lot of purging, a lot of pain, sensorial deprivation or sensorial overload. It's not easy, and it really shows where you're at with your own shit, right? But going through this then somehow doesn't really reactivate the sense of responsibility and accountability for people. So the indigenous people we're working with are saying there's a problem here because people are coming with such a thick layer of this consumptive and interpretative dimension to the teachings that they will listen selectively to what fits their self-image, the brand that they have of themselves, right? And they can't really hear beyond that. So part of the work of the collective too, upon their request, has been, can you recreate pedagogical experiences in their language that can interrupt that layer and get them to move in the direction that they should be moving here, but they aren't because now they are just consuming the experience. So we've been trying that in preparation for them to declutter the unconscious, which they do through practices that sometimes involve entheogens, sometimes involves just long-term fasting, long-term dancing, long-term singing, long-term being. In one of the communities, they get buried in the land. And here we can't do the same, and it would be seen as appropriation, and it probably would be if we did that. But we could understand the direction that, or the call of that practice, and reproduce it here with things that we have here. It's the practice from this world, but leading in the same direction, in a direction of maturity, of accountability, of trust and sobriety. And these practices do require making room for the land, for the unknown and the unknowable, but recalibrating your compass so that you can find vitality there too. So it's not just a downer. Like the composting can actually be quite joyful, but it's not, what we say in the project is that it's joyful but not pleasurable, because pleasure is still an object of consumption, right? And
another
joy
addiction.
Exactly. Joy interpolates and surprises you when it comes up. So figuring out the right amount of humor, the right amount of movement, the right amount of intellect and embodied or affective work. So but it's the same with the composting. If you use composting as a metaphor, it's the right amount of carbon, it's the right amount of it's the right amount of oxygen. You have to have the right things to do the composting, and it's the same with the body. So, but it's very difficult to get there, and it's very easy. It's a very fine line from the composting to just having a shit composting party or just having a party, right? You can cross that without knowing, and even if you are super careful, it is very difficult to keep the direction of this, the call of this, as a call of sobriety.
I know for myself, when I've been in those spaces where my shit has come up and there's enough safety, if you will, to enter that danger zone, that there's so much liberation and not having to hold up, a false self, feeling the grief. I mean, I've never felt more joy simultaneously when I felt the true depths of grief. And that's right, that seeming paradox.
I think we are yearning for that, but I think some of the desires, because they are captured in this fear thing, it creates affective forecasts that you're going to be overwhelmed. You're going to feel completely worthless. You're going to feel, you won't find a solution. You're going to be trapped. And part of the work is to prove these forecasts wrong, right? We have been afraid of how we're going to feel and not having access to the capacity to actually stay there and hold it, and seeing other people who can do it and doing it in front of you, because it's not a conceptual thing, it's an affective thing. You have to see it at work to be able to believe that you can also, that it's part of you, right? One of the things that took me in this journey, like more, there are a few things, but two of them were to do with things that happened in my family. So with a young person in the family, it was a period where, and we know that already, we work with teachers, so levels of anxiety, self-harm, and depression amongst young people are over the roof. And someone in the family was part of the statistics, and with self-harm, right? And very, very dangerous in terms of the potential for suicide. So we had to go with that question about what's going on here and what is that pain? And in conversation with this young person, the pain was described as a phantom limb pain. So that then other people said that you shouldn't be there. Like you have all your limbs. Why are you feeling pain? When we took this question to the indigenous communities, they said, well, yeah, some young people come with the sensibility, or maybe it's just a metabolic thing that people are opening up to the sensibility of the land hurting, of other people hurting, of the animals hurting, of the plants hurting. The metabolism is sick and they're feeling it. So we went back to the young person and said, would this help to see that you are not, it's not a problem with you? Because then there was the young person was complaining that there was like people telling them that there shouldn't be any pain was actually also painful, right? That there was no language to talk about it, and they were trying to numb the person from the pain, right? So when we came back with that narrative and said, does this help? The person said, yes, it does, but it doesn't stop the pain. Like, I can now understand it better, but it's still here. Can we actually do something about it? So we went back to the indigenous people and said, well, so what's next? And the response was something like, individualized hearts cannot deal with collective pain. There are practices of collectivizing our heart. And the way that this was explained to us, it was in one of the teachings by Keith Chiefbone from Alberta, but it was in another language. So the idea was that the same way that our hearing, if you're a very good hunter, you can hear close or far, and you can calibrate your hearing. You can also calibrate your heart. But this is one of the capacities that has been exiled from our possibilities within the house of modernity, right? But the most important thing is that if we don't have practices of heart collectivization, our individualized hearts, like that are kind of closed off and limited by not having access to that other capacity, get overwhelmed. And in this overwhelmness, the pain doesn't get processed. And pain is a teacher. So it needs to come and teach and move as it appears, as it encounters us. And there are teachings and practices that help you do that. And we see it a lot. One of the projects is to also compare these practices of pain release, and which doesn't mean pain elimination, right? But practices of pain release in indigenous cultures in the South and indigenous cultures in the North. But there are also practices within the house of modernity of pain attachment. So where you really hold on to the pain as part of your identity. And that becomes a form of currency and capital that gives you some worth and establishes loyalty with your community. So there are many, it's interesting because in this process of putting the communities in conversation, there are things that are coming up right now that were not there in the past, and that we might not have practices, or they might not have practices yet to deal with. And that's why they're asking for more conversation, because we need to exchange these medicines, right? And figure out how to do this differently. No community, one of the things that came up very, very strongly, no community is self-sufficient in terms of medicines. We need each other, and we need to talk mostly about what doesn't work, right? Rather than the solution. So it's a very, very different, counterintuitive for those who have been socialized within the house modernity, very counterintuitive to what we are socialized to expect.
I want to really appreciate the collective working with different indigenous peoples, and this, I think there's such the propensity right now, or this wave of kind of over romanticizing. And again, that becomes an extractive process that we feel entitled. We can go in and just adopt a methodology, and we'll find the solution. And or somehow we get caught up in a savior archetype. And I love hearing that even from the people, like, we don't have the answer, but there's a memory here, and there's access to memory, deep memory.
In practice, there are practices, there are stories, and there are practices, but the practices are more important. The stories are used to mobilize the practice, not as just concepts that should go in an encyclopedia and be passed.
And not as fixed entities, not as objects, but the stories themselves are alive.
Exactly. They're entities. They're living entities that interpolate you and that do the work for a long time. And sometimes they are rejected by the other stories already in your body. Sometimes they work together. So it's a very different relationship. Like in modernity, our ontological security, especially in peak modernity, our ontological security comes from knowing, right? And the certainty of knowing. And it's like bricklayering. We know that it's cumulative knowledge, and the idea is to create a tower of bricks and sit in the throne at the top of the tower. For them, it's weaving, and it's many, 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 many needles. And you're the weaver, and you're being woven at the same time. So you can't see the patterns that you're weaving because you're in the middle of it, but you trust that you're being watched. And in that communication with what's watching you, you're going to see if you're weaving something that shouldn't be woven like that, right? And this idea of that from the brick tower to the never-ending knitted scarf by many hands, there's a huge difference in sensibility, right? It's not when the brick wants a bit of the scarf, it turns the scarf into a brick and puts a woolen brick into the tower. But it's different when the weavers take the brick, they make it into something else to be part. But and they say it is important also to have a little bit of that knowledge, but it can't be saturating the weaving. Otherwise, people can't weave. People can't create these relationships or be in contact with that which is observing them, which is the rest of it's that metabolic biointelligence that is the driver of the needle too.
That's such a profound flip, right? Because we are so focused on seeing the object, and our sense of self being that central point, and this flipping of we are being watched. That the living world is witnessing us. I can feel that flip my own sense of relationship with the world around me.
And it's not just the watching, right? Because the whole idea, we have exercises, that we have this set of practices called radical tenderness, which were workshops before between bodies, and now we're changing it into something else because of COVID. But so there's one activity that says, like, we think that sight happens in your eyes and in your brain, but there's another sense of sensing sight, which was actually Dougal Hine who brought it to us too, where you touch, your sight touches what you see, right? So it's a different kind of vibrational interference with the other subjects that are in front of you, which are also part of you. So by drawing attention to how your sight is touching, you're also being touched by that is observing you. And the whole relationship building then of touch and sight and vibrational interference or vibrational attunement becomes a question of accountability and responsibility rather than self-expression, right? And that, or it is still autonomy, but it's accountable autonomy rather than
connected
this
autonomy.
Yes, rather than this freedom that is extremely narcissistic, right?
And looking constantly just to feed, those individual needs and desires,
which are insatiable.
I love all of your use of really rich metaphor. I know you're an educator, right? You have a position at the University of British Columbia.
Mm-hmm.
And in the article, you sent me the article Preparing for the End of the World as We Know It on the website Open Democracy, which I'll have a link to in the show notes. But in that article, and this one really hit me in the gut. I'm not a parent myself, but I have nieces and nephews who are coming of age in this time. And this question around educating these young minds, I'm witnessing them going through the industrial growth educational paradigm. And it's taking these young, fresh minds and molding it to this way of being that is ostensibly killing the life force that we're dependent upon. So I'm curious, as an educator yourself, how you work with that or struggle with that, or are you getting to play with these new pedagogies?
In schooling, it's very difficult to do that. So the last experiment that we have in relation to the end of the world as we know it came up as an invitation to speak at a conference on utopias, where they wanted to imagine what schools would look like in 2048. So the first thing when they put it to the collective, they said, well, why is it that we associate education with schools in the first place? And the second thing is, why do you think that schools will exist in 2048? And why do we think that we can imagine what is going to happen in 2048? Because generally when we imagine, we're not thinking about the consequences of the decisions that have been made in the past and in the present, right? So we decided to do an exercise, to create an exercise about education in 2048, but looking back, so as if we were in 2048, looking back at the last 28 years and what has happened. And we put for 20 years a lot of the consequences that we'll probably have to face in terms of the climate, the economy, mass migration, violence, political polarization, probably dictatorships being installed everywhere. But then Elon Musk decides to create a colony in Mars. Then the economy crashes completely. And then everything. But then something happens and we don't say what it is. And then we realize that we have led most species to extinction, that we are also leading ourselves, but we're very close to extinction, and that we need to grow up, to sober up, to clean up, to show up very differently to each other. and to abolish a number of things, including inequality, racial violence, colonial violence, all of that, and realize that education is about eldership from the moment you were born. Education should prepare you to become a healthy elder for all relations and a good ancestor after you die. So that exercise was really interesting because both in the conference and now I've been using it with educators. It's very, very interesting to see how people respond. So that we ask, number one, what do you think the event was that made us realize that we had been completely irresponsible and arrogant? And the second thing is how did you respond to this exercise, right? And we are noticing that for, like, it's probably 50-50. For 50% of the people, they are getting anxious because we are not talking about it. Mm-hmm. So when they see an exercise like that, it is relief. Yes, finally we're naming and we are talking. But for 50% of the people, it's like, this is taking me into a position of hopelessness. And I can't deal with this. The saturation here is of a different kind. And I do not have space for it. Why are you doing this to me? This is violent. I just want to go back. We just need to go back to normal, right? And it's interesting because before the pandemic, the distribution would have been 10%, 90% of the people saying, what are you talking about, right? Now we have probably in the 40 saying, thank you for naming this for us and for helping us sit with this as educators. But there's still a lot of people who are not, like we got somebody saying, like, education is about happiness, you're taking this away from us and from the students, but their happiness and hope, right? The happiness and hope is the hope in the continuity of the promises that have been made by the House of Modernity without, or within sometimes a technotopic understanding that the climate change either doesn't exist or is going to be sorted by technology, or that the economy, that there are adults in charge and the economy is going to be sorted. I don't know what they would say after watching the presidential debate, the first presidential debate in the United States. If there's still the idea that there are adults in the room, I don't know about that. But there's still the sense that if something was wrong, somebody would have done something about it, right? And therefore, your body is not authorized to bring this to us. Maybe from a different body, I don't know. But there is there's a shift. There is a shift in education in that direction because of the pandemic, probably if we have more, and also because of the unrest in Black Lives Matter and all the struggles for racial justice happening, there is more movement because of that. If we have more civil unrest in the US, which is likely, this is also going to change. So it is to do with the water and the flood again. As the waters rise, there's more receptivity on the one hand, but there's also more pushback or more alienation. Then there is the risk that more people are going to support somebody who will say, I will be the strong force that will bring order by securing your autonomy, your authority, and your arbitration, right, of justice here, which is what's happening with Trump, for example, or Bolsonaro. So it's more sober, more examples of sobriety, of a call for maturity and eldership, more examples of humility, more examples of people trying to devise a politics that is not based on entitlements or exceptionalism or enthronement or exaltedness, this self-congratulatory stuff. This is what we need right now so that people can hear the call for a different way of existing and then have the needs change. It's not that they have their old needs met. They just change to service and stamina, and again, sobriety and sagacity, also to see what's coming next and not being afraid of it, right? We talk about the buffalo in the project. This is a Cree story that is coming from Cash's mom, Mabel. And she says that in a snowstorm, if the buffalo stops, because of the way that the structure of the buffalo's body, it gets covered with snow and it's going to die. But because it already knows through the biointelligence this, if there's a snowstorm coming, it aligns itself heading towards the snow, but in an angle. And it has to keep moving, like one paw after the other, one hoof after the other. Otherwise it gets covered, otherwise it dies. But if it doesn't die, the storm is actually, it walks with the storm. And that's probably what we will have to do too, to create that stamina, to develop those muscles, to be able to be, it's not even strength, I wouldn't call it strength, it's the vitality to be able to face multiple storms together.
I love this idea of education as eldership. Take it out of like the hallways of the ivory tower, because I feel like we in modernity, we're trapped in adolescence at best. So I'm hearing this trajectory from entitlement to accountability. And that there's so much fear around, oh, but we're going to have to let go of so much. And maybe we'll come to know like real happiness in letting go of a lot of that junk and the addictions. And I feel like 2020 has been the year that the water has risen, certainly above our knees, maybe to our bum. Maybe. I use the metaphor, the name of the podcast, temperatures rise, as temperatures rise.
It could be as the waters rise too.
As the waters rise, we learn to swim. We adapt new capacities.
Yeah, the idea of education as eldership came from a conversation in a research project actually with John Cryer. So there was a research project where we interviewed lots of elders. We went to their site, their sacred site, and we asked, what is education for? Nobody, I can tell you, said education was for employment. And everybody had a version of education for eldership. But John Cryer, who's a Cree elder from Alberta, had a beautiful story that now we have the permission to tell to 4 mountains. And I'll just say it very quickly in my own words too. So the first mountain is the baby mountain, where you need to be carried up the mountain, and on the way down, you have to hold the hands of somebody as you're learning to walk on your own. Then there is the warrior mountain, which could be equivalent to the teenage mountain, where you go into a dark forest to discover who you are. But who you are is not a fixed thing. Who you are is the medicine you carry. And the trees know what this medicine is, but they cannot tell you because you don't know how to communicate with the trees yet. And what happens is that you are fighting the shadows of the trees, like Don Quixote, right? And what he said, many people just get lost there and stay there. They don't get out. But once you go to the peak of this mountain and you figure out what your medicine is, you need to cook it. You need to be very intimate with your medicine on the way down. And it is an individual process of really getting acquainted with that which is coming through you. But a medicine is only a medicine when it's gifted. So in the next mountain, which is the provider mountain or the hunter mountain, is where you're starting to give it away. And in the beginning, you can only give away a little bit because it's not really cooked yet. But once you get to the peak of that mountain and the medicine is really well cooked, and you know when it is a medicine and when it's a poison, what it's for, what it's not for, when you have to come in and give it and when not, when it's not your turn yet. So on the way down, you integrate your medicine with the medicines around you, right? So you create a collective, you create a feast of medicines for your community. And the last medicine behind the three first ones is the elder medicine, the elder mountain, last mountain. Last mountain at the end is the last mountain. And to be able to get there, you have to actually go around the other three mountains. And as you go around, you are helping with the rites of passage from the child mountain to the warrior mountain, from the warrior mountain to the provider mountain, because you've been there. And as you get to the elder mountain, which is very close, the beginning is very close to the child, the baby mountain, you are the one carrying the kids up, because unlike the warriors, you have patience. Unlike the hunters or the providers, you have time. So you're responsible for that first step. That's why the kids need to be with their grandparents. And as you do a little bit of that and you go up your elder mountain, you're prepared to shed your body. And once you shed your body, which is the happiest moment actually for you, because you will be able to see that all across the mountains and everywhere, you have been held by not only your human ancestors, but your non-human ancestors too. And then you join that beyond form, beyond time, beyond space dimension where you are an ancestor yourself. So this was one of the most beautiful stories that we've been told that now becomes so important also for young people in the collective, right?
Yeah,
because we don't have that.
We don't have that. No, I feel the grief in my own being of like, where was that story in my own becoming? And it's a really exquisite story, and I think a lovely place to bring our time to an end. And I certainly hope to share that story with my nieces and nephews and any little people that come through my world. And because it's so inclusive too, as you're sharing it, it makes room for the pain and the shit, and as a part of these natural cycles.
Yeah. And if you think about also like the complexity inside of ourselves, we have the other metaphor is the bus. I'm not going to go there, but we have people everywhere. Like if you think about there are elders inside of you already pushing everybody to go in that direction, but there are also teenagers saying, I'm going to stay in the warrior mountain because I'm still fighting these shadows of the trees, and I'm really obsessed with that. So how do we get the whole being to hear a call for maturity, right? For growing up and for showing up differently in this offering of gifting of medicines that we need so much right now.
We need so much right now. Vanessa, thank you so much for sharing your medicine with me today.
Thank you.
All right, friends. So that concludes the wonderful interview with Vanessa. I hope you enjoyed it. And just as a reminder, again, to please share the podcast with friends and family, give it a review on Apple Podcast, and if you can, please join us as a patron and join us for our bi-monthly live sessions. We'll have one coming up this month in November, and you can do that by going to the website www.astemperaturesrise.com and click on the support button, which will take you to the Patreon page. And just for even $3 a month contribution, you'll help the podcast stay alive and bringing valuable content. And you can also join us for the live sessions. So, my friends, as a reminder, as Vanessa tells us, who you are is the medicine you carry. And so may we be who we are and carry our medicine out into the world. Until next time.